afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Busse. I'm Chief Digital Officer at Terazo, and joining me today is David Dirt. David is CEO of the newly launched Forestry ML, previously of the Capital One Center for Machine Learning, and prior to that of Notch, a local Richmond, Virginia-based AI and machine learning company. David's going to talk to us today about using machine learning and AI to predict COVID-19 response and recovery. So I'm going to go ahead and let him get going with the presentation, and then we'll come back afterwards. I'll do a little bit of Q&A, and then we'll open it up for some audience Q&A. David?
Cool. Thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks, everybody, for taking some time with me today for this call. I've been looking forward to this.
Thank you. And if we could just ask everybody to go ahead and put yourselves on mute as we go through, and the host will be able to do that if anybody accidentally comes off. Go ahead.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. All right. So slide number one that I wanted to get into today is a caveat slide. This LinkedIn message here on the right I thought was really funny. The guy got a lot of flack for it from the data science community, but he was basically telling everybody stop using your ARIMA models and all these basic data science sort of techniques to act like you've discovered something great. Like pandemics, by their very nature are chaotic systems, and to use any kind of traditional means for prediction just really doesn't kind of make sense. So, there's a lot about this disease that is unprecedented. There's still a lot that we don't understand. And even if the current curve is flattening, I think we all know that we could be in for a second wave and so forth. So none of this is meant to be authoritative. I'm just one guy in my basement running 12 Jupyter notebooks while I'm in between business development calls. So there's that. So I think what I've been most impressed with, and I think probably a lot of people have seen, is the Johns Hopkins data. This is both an open data set that they've published on GitHub and a data visualization that you can sort of drill down by different territories and look at confirmed cases, testing rates, hospitalization, and recoveries, which I think all of these time series data sets are very important for any kind of the correlation activities that we'd be attempting to do. So here is that Johns Hopkins data set. I'm happy to link this in the chat after I'm done presenting, but these are one of the open sets that have been utilizing in my exercises. Okay, so to level set everybody and get on the same page for what we're talking about when we say reopen a city, it's pretty widely agreed that these four conditions will have to be met to reopen. And those are hospitals safely able to treat all patients who need it. In a lot of these concentrated areas, that's not the case today. We've heard stories about even deaths like in hallways and things of that nature. At least everyone with symptoms can be tested, which I think is ultimately going to be one of the harder things to meet just because of the testing shortages. Confirmed cases and their contacts can be monitored. This is a pretty interesting topic. I think Apple and Google just released some statements saying that they're going to sort of open up Bluetooth pings and other technologies on mobile device to better be able to track known cases, as well as sort of the social distancing guidelines of 6 feet, about crowds of 10 or less, and things of that nature. And then the number of cases fall for at least 14 days. This is the easiest numeric one to track. So some of the other statistics that we'd be looking for are a 3-day moving average that's going down over that period of time. So one of the interesting things about this is I personally have not seen a point in history where the news has been continually so focused on one thing for so long. I mean, I think the biggest comparison I could draw would be 9/11, but that was a terrorist attack is a unforeseen one-time event that everybody responds to. This is a unforeseen but then seen and realized global epidemic, and it's not just a United States thing. It's truly a global crisis. So all headlines have been covering the COVID-19 or coronavirus, and so my chief revenue officer, Brian Forrester, and I were talking about this, and we were like, well, like, what could we be doing in this space? And I didn't want to just, get into the prediction space, Johns Hopkins and everybody, like all these other research programs at universities are doing their models, and I'm not going to try to contend with that. So he had the idea of why don't we look for news sentiment and sort of use news as a data set to look for when things might be breaking or the tide might be shifting. So most pre-trained models are in the NLP space for sentiment analysis are trained on data sets like Reddit comment threads, IMDb, movie ratings, and comments there, tweets. So this sentence we can see here: COVID cases worldwide topping 1.8 million. Obviously, this is not positive news, but based on the data set it was trained on, it makes sense. So to a familiar domain, it works well, but news is different than those other types of sentiment sets that these models are trained on. So just going like core out of the box with like a flare sentiment analysis, or even trying to use AWS comprehend, you just get results that don't make any sense. So what I'm working on doing now is some NLP techniques to give more contextual awareness to the topic that we're speaking about. So when we look at these two headlines here, there's a couple concepts that we need to sort of bake into the model. One is we need sort of a lexicon of synonyms, and so we know if we're talking about COVID-19, that's the same thing as coronavirus, that's the same thing as SARS, SARS-2, or whatever that name for the disease is the same as virus and things like that. We need to know that having tests is good, and therefore test shortages are bad. So these are the kinds of things that we want to be labeling in headlines to start to train our models on. So a couple NLP techniques in the language processing space that we're going to be looking at are vectorization. So anybody that's taken any seen any material or trainings on natural language use cases, these are some very canonical examples where man is to woman as king is to queen, and you can almost do like word algebra on these things. So like man minus woman, or queen minus woman plus man equals king, stuff like that. We also have stemming and lemon, so parts of speech would go down to like or specific words like walk and walked are two derivatives of a common verb. And we have a lot of open implementations, Word2Vec, Glove, FastText, Elmo, and BERT. But you can do your own sort of vectorization, and what that really means is we're looking for numeric representations of language. So machine learning models are all work on all numeric data, but natural language is of course not. So we need to encode features into that data set that we can train models on. So then the second thing that we'd be looking at doing there is some topic modeling. And some of the techniques there, we'd be using TF-IDF. So that's a term frequency inverse document frequency. Basically, what that's going to do for us is, all these news headlines and news stories that we're reading are all about coronavirus and COVID-19. So that would emerge as, the most frequent term, certainly, but we're actually looking for subcategories. So what TD-IDF will do for us in this case is it'll look at these terms that are appearing, but give that a discounted importance rate if it's occurring across documents. So I think I've got something like maybe like 2,000 or 3,000 news stories scraped right now that we're processing, and COVID-19 is going to show up in all of them because that's specifically what I'm scraping. So that needs to be discounted as we're looking for other topics within it. So other topics that we'd expect to emerge would be things about the economy opening back up, things about death rates and hospital conditions, sort of like tertiary industry effects, you know, like businesses closing, things like that, other parts of the world like Europe and how things are going there. So one of the other exercises that we're doing too is, as we saw, the model for sentiment really doesn't indicate whether it's good news or bad news. So this is using a labeling tool called Prodigy to take a look at every headline and give it a label to whether this headline itself is going to be pro or con sort of piece of news material when we're training our models. So Prodigy is a very easy to use visual interface where you can just take a look at a piece of text and label it good or bad or skip it. And then another data set that we thought would be interesting to look at here is like how the major markets are responding. So here I've got some data for the last year of the Dow Jones. Coming up, I have Bitcoin and then a gold ETF index. So the first plot, you're just looking at the Dow Jones for the last calendar year. You know, obviously we see this incredible drop here, and I'll fast forward a little bit. Like on the same date, each of the markets experience the same kind of thing. Like if you look here to, you know, pretty much the right of the first graph on each, we see this stark drop. But what's interesting about that is, you know, some of these markets respond much differently. You know, so the Dow has started to stabilize on news of the stimulus package and things like that. But if we look to the right, and if we look at just since February, we still see a lot of volatility. So these candlestick plots here are showing us, you know, highs, lows, opens, and closes. And any black filled in box is going to be a decline on that day, and any white box is an increase of the overall index. And then, so you can see in sort of like normal conditions, the boxes aren't very big, they're actually quite small. So this is a sort of a just good eye test for us to show the sort of craziness that the market is undergoing during this time. Bitcoin I thought would be interesting because in times of fear, you know, people have gone to Bitcoin or gold as seen as more of a safe haven. So if the markets are crashing, you know, alternative kind of investing strategies emerge, and Bitcoin I think has stabilized a little more quickly. And then gold is actually up from where it was before the pandemic hit. So, you know, I think there, through economic recessions, gold does tend to go up for the same kind of reasons. So this pandemic has triggered that effects to happen. So my idea board that I'm sort of just burning down with things to try as I have time. Different data sets, as we've mentioned, news. I think social media could be interesting as well, but there's a lot of noise in social data. The financial indices we just saw, and then the COVID open data sets like Johns Hopkins, the World Health Organization, healthdata.org, and then the New York Times has one that goes county by county. So if you wanted to do anything that was more localized to very specific regions and demographics, that's a nice data set to work with. And then, you know, I think, you know, even though the stimulus has like staved the bleeding a little bit on the stock market, we're also very close to earnings reports, unemployment data coming out. You know, like we've seen all the jobless claims, I think something like 16+ million in the last 3 weeks. And then techniques there on the right side. A few of these we've talked about, but I think named entity recognition is interesting. I think what's kind of neat about this problem is it treats news as a time series itself. So like anomalies on counts, frequencies, even like percentage of the home page, that's dominated by code right now. So it's been 100% for the last probably 3 or 4 weeks. But as that goes down to, like 75%, we see other news stories starting to take a foothold back. Like maybe that's important too, as a leading indicator. N-grams, vectorization, other kinds of NLP topics, just the regular good news, bad news modeling, training, topic modeling, correlating some of these, and then I think ultimately having some kind of fear or volatility index that's kind of a aggregate of all these things would be kind of interesting to see how things are stabilizing. And a lot of this is it's like the true insights we won't really see until this is all over. A big part of this is we're experimenting right now, but nothing is solved. We still don't know what the end looks like. So, in a lot of ways, we don't know what we're yet looking for, but we might have some interesting things. So I think during this time, for me, data collection and just basic experiments have been the most productive thing to do. So, right now it's just about collecting the data, aggregating, and continually running experiments on it. So with that, Chris, I think those are my slides. So I want to hand it back to you for a little bit of discussion, then I think we'll open it up to Q&A for the group.
Awesome. Thank you, David. And that was really neat to see kind of what we all, I think, at least myself as a technical practitioner, often working in very crunchy enterprise spaces, kind of seeing these ideas and thinking applied to something that is bigger than all of us or any one group of us combined right now. I'll make a quick call out. I did mention in the chat, but I'll make a call out before I start some of the questions that I had prepared, that if you have questions that you'd like to ask or have me ask, go ahead and use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. I'll do my best to call on you so you can ask those questions yourself a little bit later. But if you don't want to actually ask the question yourself, you are welcome to preface it with Chris ask, and I will, time permitting, try to select out those questions and ask them as well. So David, I've kind of prepared a few questions, and it starts a little bit more on the, let's call it the methodological. I'm not going to get too deep into some of the machine learning aspects, because I'm really curious. What really struck me is because we have this opportunity to talk about something that is societal and something that involves the media, I really want to start and at least focus my questions on that as it relates to your methodology and how even that methodology either evolved to the point where it is or might evolve more over time.
Mm-hmm.
So first I want to ask about the choice of using the news media headlines as that sort of input data to analyze. I think, we all know that sometimes headlines can be derisively considered to be clickbait, or they call out something that really isn't the main focus of an article. A lot of times also, news agencies pick up articles off of a newswire, such as the AP newswire, and then have them on all their sites. So some articles versus original reporting might show up in volume a bit greater. So you can talk a little bit about kind of the choice of the headlines as an input and what you're looking at to sanitize those inputs or have faith that this is the thing that you want to base these on versus, say, full body of the article or other things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there can be some gamesmanship in headlines. Certainly, like clickbait is one of them. I think for smaller things too, early days of trading Bitcoin is another good example where like one publication could sort of like temporarily tip the scale. So if you knew that was coming out, it's almost like insider trading, just because you could game the system a little bit. So one thing that I think is important when using headlines themselves as a data set is to make the sample as representative as possible. So I think taking media sources that lean to the left, that lean to the right, and then those that try to toe the line as neutrally as possible is one good way. Two is, from AP and other like press outlets, some of the deduplication is important, or even if not deduplication, showing that this has shown up in multiple channels is at least another sort of data point that we can go off of there. From there, I think headlines is just one part of it too. Like I actually have a scraper that's waking up on a Lambda trigger every day and like collecting the news text itself. So I think that's interesting as well, because a lot of people will just look at front page, maybe click like through one or two kind of things, and so the headlines is really what's informing their perception of the news and media coverage. I think that's why it was interesting.
Yeah. So you actually prompted a new question, but you actually got ahead of one of the questions I was going to ask here. And I'm not going to present my screen, but I've changed my background to this chart, which floats around. I can pop a thing in the chat for it, but this is a media bias chart, right? And along the x-axis, you have Wonket on one side and InfoWars on the other, right?
Yeah.
And the y-axis here is trustworthiness. So you've got Inquirer here, AP and CNN up top here. You mentioned, a recognition of left versus right, and neutral, of course, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's the whole, trustworthiness of these things. I'd be curious, kind of like, why not just go for the neutral? Or like, is there value in kind of going out to the extremes, and how far up to the extremes of partisan things? Because, I'm not gonna, if you read out there, you'll certainly see that some people even think that certain media outlets are, mouthpieces of government. And I think from some countries, media outlets are mouthpieces of the government, de facto. So can you double click and dig in a little bit on, we talk about algorithmic bias a lot, right? Media bias and training set bias as you approach this problem here.
Yeah, so I think the reason that it's important is because, a lot of what we're trying to represent and capture here is the view of a society. So even though the news is going to be biased, like that's where people are going to get their information. So like, just because these groups are slanted one way or another, I think is actually very interesting. Because we want subjective information mixed in with objective here as well. So objective, I would say, is news, like, is completely out the window. There you're just going for health data and things like that. So news is sort of like that subjectivity lens to line up with the objective data and see if we actually have any leading indicators. I think one like longer term thing, what I also like about this project is like there could be nice like longer term outcomes from this that I just wouldn't have delved into, but I have always thought were interesting. Just how much coverage is one channel giving a topic versus another? How much focus is Donald Trump getting on one channel versus another versus Fauci? I think even correlations like that and sentiment around how our named entities in these topics is represented per each channel is actually quite interesting, just as a side effect of all of this.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think that it's fascinating. The one that you mentioned, you kind of mentioned how the Johns Hopkins was a time series, and you talked about the Lambda cycle, or sorry, the Lambda job that you have that's picking things up, I think, every morning, if I heard you correctly. Mm-hmm. People often talk about like the 24-hour news cycle, right? And this may be a little bit of an aside or not something that you've dug into, but from kind of looking at the evolution of this topic over time across sources, is there anything you can tell us that you've seen around the news cycle? Is it a 24-hour news cycle? Is it evolving faster than that in this context? What are you seeing as far as that speed of information, kind of that bloom as it comes out and disseminates?
Yeah, I would say it's very bursty. So I think the news in general tries to hit at times where it knows that its audience is going to be logging in. If it's not to their site directly, it's to a social media channel. So that would generally be in the morning, at lunch, mid-afternoon. The biggest bursts have come after like press briefings. I think like last night after Trump's press briefing, there was a wave on every channel where, you know, headlines probably doubled. You know, he said some pretty emotional stuff like to the media in that too. So I think that drove a lot of it as well. So um, I have been rolling up daily just as my sort of indicator. Like I haven't gone to a level of detail to see if those bursts themselves are interesting at all. I imagine like maybe there are some insights there, but just, you know, again, being a guy working on this part-time, like daily has been sort of good enough.
Yeah. And I think it's really cool what you've accomplished just kind of as a side of desk activity here. I want to talk a little bit about, let's go with this question next. And again, a reminder to the audience, please don't hesitate to use anything, you know, use the Q&A feature there. I'm going to look back at that screen in a moment here to see what questions might have come through. But you had that disclaimer, I think, at the very beginning, where that had caused kind of riled people up in the data science community. And I had actually started doing a little bit of my own data analysis, kind of just looking at like the new cases per day, because it seemed like countries like South Korea that were ahead of the curve. You know, there was a nice bell curve, right? And you could almost look at the quartiles of that bell curve and the new, you know, the new cases. And then I had come across a similar article that was really talking about like, look, you're not an epidemiologist. You shouldn't be putting out doing these data things, or if you do, don't put it out there publicly. You shouldn't say it. And I tend to take a personally a philosophical perspective that people should kind of question the source of any data, right? And look to see, like, if I put something out there, right, or it's just Chris, or it's just David, right, that's putting these things out there, I need to take this with a grain of salt. We're not epidemiologists. So I think you did a good job certainly putting the disclaimer at the front of this, but you know, it's a neat thing to explore. And I think you see this concept in certain professions of gatekeeping, right? That's like, oh, well, you can't do this if you haven't reached this level of certification or whatnot, or things like that. So for people that might want to either, you know, get into this themselves, or who are, you know, readers and consumers of this information, is there guidance you can give either as somebody that wants to be an amateur publisher, an amateur participant in this, and also as people who are consuming things that might be from people that are varying levels of proficiency, you know, or eminency, I guess. What should we be looking for as an audience as we consume this kind of data? Like, what are the things we should almost question to know, like, all right, like, is their methodology sound here?
Yeah, that's a big one. So I think I'll start with that guy, you know, because he sort of became a villain among the data science community after posting that. You know, he had to come back and say, look, I love data and I love this profession. That's why I do it for a living. I think he's talking more to the people that, you know, run a notebook and like say that their answer is gospel or they've figured something out. So I think, you know, like warning against that is what he was doing. And I think what like everybody should do. So even the data that we have that we think is objective and as true source as possible, like there are problems with that as well. You know, we know that there aren't enough tests available. So can we like truly take the number of deaths and confirmed cases? Like probably not. On the other side of things, you know, like even the people that have died, if they had coronavirus, that is being counted as a death, like regardless, you know. So like we could have deaths that were caused for other reasons, and just because they like had traces of the virus, like that gets marked down too. So I think like always knowing how the data was collected is very important. I think I would encourage everybody to do their own hobby projects. So if you want to get into this space, like don't try to predict something that you're not qualified for, but if you think there could be something interesting, like this project I think is a good example. Like I'm not trying to solve anything really. I'm trying to look for interesting insights, and have picked news media as that source. So pick something that you think is kind of neat or to play around with. And yeah, it's a good next step after your Kaggle data set, because you'll have to do things like clean it, make decisions on how long you want to how often you want to grab it and aggregate it, and how you're going to engineer features out of it.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's really good guidance, because I think it's something that's just fascinating to dig into here. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to dig into the questions I'm getting from the audience. I've got two. Cool. I'll actually ask one of them, and then we will certainly welcome some more. All right. So I like how you got, all right, COVID hit, right? The market tanked. I think there are some people, that might have said that, hey, the market was overvalued to begin with. This was going to happen after the election anyway, because people one way or the other were not going to be happy with the outcome of the election. Like, this was an inevitable thing. I think we've seen it, further than anybody could have ever expected, right? So you've already kind of got this thing where you might be using market indicators to drive your predictions. Can you turn that around, right? If you are getting confidence in the recovery here, is this something where you might have data that could go as far as guide us to like buy some S&P 500 futures? where how do you turn this around and like invert it back out to what it was there, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I will say that I am not trading based on my own work. So please, nobody else do it. Or if you do, yeah, this is not a hedge fund. This is not the beginning of a hedge fund. Nothing like that. So I think what's interesting about a recession is it can be onset for a number of different reasons. And I think you're right. Like, the general consensus were things were inflated anyway. We know in an election year, there's some volatility. And, I think, when you see the bond rates invert a couple times in pretty quick successions, like, these are indicators that have historically said that a recession is coming. My hope is that this epidemic is just what triggered the already coming recession, and it can just be a singular event instead of sort of multiple events like stacking up on top of each other. So if this, it's really weird. It's almost like I don't even know what I'm hoping for.
Right.
I don't want two recessions. So if this can just be the event,
right.
like, great. Not great, but like, that would be better than a cascading effect of like continual downturn.
Yeah, we can only hope that it's not going to get worse from that regard there. All right, so one of the questions that we got from the audience, and I apologize to the questioner if I mispronounce your name, but Abia Zahir asked me to ask, what was one of the most shocking pieces of information you found that predicts about COVID-19? I guess, was there something unexpected or really surprising that you found that was actually maybe driving some of the trends or predictions? Or are you at that point now where you can look back?
I would say I'm not to that point. I think, I hope at the end of this exercise, I'll have enough insights to make a Medium post or something like that about, and because I think that something interesting will be derived from here. Like, right now, I would say I'm at the data collection and feature engineering stage more than I am any kind of like insight. So there hasn't been anything that's been like, oh man, I'm really onto something here yet. Like, that moment I think will be greatly satisfying for me, but it hasn't come yet.
Cool. Thanks for the answer. And I'm about to call on a member of the audience there who messaged me privately. So you go ahead and get ready to unmute here in a second. But I did want to call out, they also said that they're having some trouble with the Q&A feature at the bottom. And so this next audience participant that I'm about to call on is kind of the last question that we have queued up here. So please, if you're having some challenges with the Q&A feature, don't hesitate to send me a chat, and I'll be happy to kind of facilitate it accordingly. So with that in mind, Chris Gatewood, you have a question about the news tracking aspect. You want to go ahead and unmute and unvideo yourself?
Yeah, I'd say hey. Hope everybody's safe and sheltering in place and all that good stuff that everybody's required to say these days. The thing about news is when David first started talking about it, I'll confess I had a moment to think, well, okay, fine. Now we're just grasping at data sources because we don't know what else to do beyond Johns Hopkins and the New York Times. But I think for the economic aspect of it, the question everybody has, leaders, politicians, business owners, our clients, your clients, the question everybody has is, when do we start acting a little more normally?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, to David's points about how the stock market reacts to news, and therefore, that's certainly mixed in. Some are more obvious about it than others, but certainly mixed into how governors and the president and other leaders, local and regional and state, react to when we start to, in some, couple months from now, I guess. New UVA study said maybe August, which was further out than I had hoped, for Virginia anyway. So as we look at the economic aspects of it, I think the news trending piece, because like David and the rest of us, I've been really amazed at how every single, or about maybe, 80 to 90% of every headline you see is all about coronavirus.
Yeah.
It's taken over the news, like David said at the outset, to an extent that's just remarkable. So I think when that starts to tail off a little bit and folks start to realize that there are other things happening in the world, maybe that's a leading indicator that things can start to get back to normal. So obviously it's all related. We track the health trends and hospitalizations and medical system capacities and all these things. But I think the news tracking across all sources, to one of Busse's questions, which is, do we just look at the neutral ones or do we look at all of them? I think all of them mix into whatever we can consider to be the public perception of this thing. So I think that's valuable, and I'd be fascinated to see anything that David's able to come up with, as he said, in his spare time, about any kind of tracking, or when does, we're all looking at when does infection rate crest in any particular area. It'll also be interesting if it's find outable to post and publish and track and have a look at when do the news perceptions and the headlines start to get back to where there's a little bit of air in the room for something else.
Yeah.
So
that's
I
a
great
set of points, Chris. And you touched on the geography component as well as a time component. Like there is certainly a national perception going on here, and that's largely what I've been after so far. But I think as certain geographies like open back up, being able to track those decisions, that is something that I'm starting to look out for, is, this city plans to reopen on this date, and then look for sort of as the curve that was leveling off or even going down starts to go up again in that location. I think that could be super interesting, and that could help inform other cities' decisions as well, like knowing what measures that city took or state took, and sometimes going first is not the best thing for those reasons, because you have more information later.
Thank you, Chris, for the question there, and thank you, David, for the great answer there. So I've got, I guess, one more question, that and it kind of relates, I think, to some of those indicators that Chris was asking about, and then I'll kind of turn it over to Nick or y'all for some final thoughts, and Nick for some announcements and other news. But what do we, David, what can we, and maybe this is something where you're just gonna, the output is this kind of presentation, but what do you target? How far, before this is all said and done, right? How far do you think you can take this? Like, do you think you can hone in on a date when the US borders open again internationally, or we can travel to Europe again? Like, for the work that you're doing, what might we see come out of this, or what do you hope to get from this as you continue to tinker with the algorithm and consume news sources and mess through this again while you're launching your company and building that as well during this time?
Yep, totally. So I would say I would love it if I felt like I could predict, but news sources are just going to tell what's already happening. So really, I'm treating news as sentiment here, or perception, I think is a good word for it as well, more than I am a when. I just don't think that this data set is going to tell us anything that we don't know, because news by its very nature is reporting what's already going on. What I do think my hopeful outcomes are some level of insight. This is an event that we've never seen. So when that next kind of thing hits, hopefully nothing of this scale, but maybe we know more about it because of this. The other thing is I think this actually could have some value for people that want to monitor news or social media cycles. Like, I think this is a pretty easy, like, SaaS kind of platform where, you can just put in your frequency, your search terms, and the sources that you're interested in, and like, let this like build you a data set for topics like not coronavirus, like something that you just want to monitor, maybe for your company, or maybe for personal interest, or maybe you're looking at like one company for stock trading or something like that. And monitoring like that, I think, is pretty cool. So like, some of those things just might be nice services to offer after this.
So we'll look forward to the eventual launch of the Forestry ML SaaS platform, news prediction platform as a service there. That's awesome. All right. Well, thank you, David. Appreciate the time you put together to do all this. I'm getting some echo here in my audio, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nick for any closing statement.
Hey, thanks, Chris. And thanks, David. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today.